11 Facts I Learned About Joseph Smith and Church History reading Rough Stone Rolling. About the book, while many experts continue to view Joseph Smith as a controversial figure, renowned scholar and Latter-day Saint Richard Bushman locates Joseph in his historical and cultural context, fleshing out the many nuances of 19th century American life that produced such a fertile ground for emerging religion. While this book stands in the intersection of faith and scholarship, it does not avoid the problematic aspects of Smith's life and work, such as his practice of polygamy, his early attempts at treasure-seeking, and his later political aspirations. In the end, Smith emerges as a genuine American phenomenon, a man driven by inspiration, but not unaffected by his cultural context. About the author, Richard L. Bushman, a general editor of the Joseph Smith Papers, he has been appointed Howard W. Hunter Visiting Professor at Claremont Graduate University. He received his BA and PhD degrees from Harvard University. He taught at Brigham Young University, Boston University, and the University of Delaware before joining the Columbia faculty. He has served as president of the Mormon History Association and the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. Disclaimer: this video and presentation is not associated with Richard L. Bushman, Rough Stone Rolling, the publisher, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In the comments, opinions made throughout the presentation are the comments and opinions of myself and not of Richard L. Bushman, Rough Stone Rolling, the publishers, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I hand-type most, if not all, quotations and references throughout this presentation. If there are any errors in the text, they are from me and not the reference. What you're about to learn may seem difficult to most LDS members. Please research all topics presented before coming to any conclusion. Fact number 1. Joseph Smith was heavily involved with treasure seeking using a seer stone. Joseph used that same seer stone to translate the Book of Mormon. Other saints use seer stones. Do you remember this children's film? I always thought it was weird that Hiram Page used a rock for revelation.
Chapter 14, The Prophet and Revelations for the Church, September 1830. Joseph and Emma Smith moved back to New York. A man named Hiram Page lived there. He was a member of the church. He had a stone that he said helped him receive revelations for the church. Many church members believed Hiram Page, including Oliver Cowdery. Some people thought Hiram Page was a prophet. Oliver asked Joseph about Hiram Page. Joseph prayed, and Jesus gave him a revelation. Jesus said that only one man could receive revelations for the entire church. That man was the prophet Joseph Smith. Jesus said that Oliver and others could receive revelations for themselves, but not for the entire church. Oliver believed Joseph. He knew that Hiram Page's revelations were wrong. Jesus told Oliver to talk to Hiram Page. Oliver told him that the revelations he received through the stone were not from God. Oliver said that Satan had tricked Hiram Page. Hiram listened to Oliver and repented. Today, only the president of the church receives revelations for the whole church. He is a prophet of God. Members of the church should obey the prophet.
The early church leaders understood seer stone use. Evidence of this from the Hiram Page use of a seer stone. From the book. When Joseph arrived in Fayette in September, the Whitmers and Cowdery were studying revelations of Hiram Page, the husband of David Whitmer's sister Catherine. He had a roll of papers, as Newell Knight reported it, full of revelations through a stone. We learned from the Joseph Smith papers about this event in more detail. Mr. Whitmer, having invited us to go and live with him on account of the great persecution which had been got up against us in Harmony, Pennsylvania, we arrived at Fayette during the last week of August, amidst the congregation of our brethren and friends. To our great grief, however, we found that Satan had been lying in wait to deceive and seeking whom he might devour. Brother Hiram Page had got in his possession a certain stone, by which he obtained to certain revelations concerning the upbuilding of Zion, the order of the church, and so forth, but which were entirely at variance with the order of God's house, as it is laid down in the scriptures and our own late revelations. As a conference meeting had been appointed for the 1st of September, I thought it wisdom to do much more than converse with the brethren on the subject until the conference should be held. Finding, however, that many of the brethren, especially the Whitmer family and Oliver Cowdery, were believing much in the things which were set forth by this stone, a few of us got together and succeeded in obtaining the following revelations, which gave us much information on that and other subjects connected with our respective duties. Conference at length assembled, the subject of the stone was brought up, and after considerable discussion, reasoning, and investigation, Hiram agreed to renounce the stone and its author, and the brethren unanimously agreed to renounce them also. To gain a better understanding of Joseph's seer stone use, the author of Rough Stone Rolling takes us back to Joseph's time as a seer and money digger. Neither his education nor his Christian upbringing prepared Joseph to translate a book, but the magic culture may have. Treasure seeking taught Joseph to look for the unseen in a stone. His first reaction when he brought home the Urim and Thummim was delight with its divining powers. "I can see anything," he told his friend Joseph Knight. He knew from working with his seer stone what to expect from the Urim and Thummim. He would see. Practice with the scrying stone carried over to translation of the gold plates. In fact, as work on the Book of Mormon proceeded, a seer stone took the place of the Urim and Thummim as an aid in the work, blending magic with inspired translation. Was Joseph a hired seer? Joseph Knight Jr. said his father thought Joseph Jr. was the best hand he ever hired, but that was not the reason Stoll brought young Joseph all the way from Palmyra to work in 1825. Stoll believed that he had located a site of an ancient Spanish mine where coins had been minted and buried. Through the summer of 1825, he put his hired hands to work on the site, which lay some 26 miles downriver from his farm in Harmony Township, Pennsylvania. When his men failed to locate the cache, Stoll enlisted the Smiths' help, and Joseph Smith Sr. and Joseph Jr. agreed to join the diggers in Harmony. Stoll went to the trouble of bringing Joseph Jr. from Manchester. Lucy explained, on account of having heard that he possessed certain keys by which he could discern things invisible to the natural eye. Joseph had discovered 2 stones, one in 1822 while digging a well with Willard Chase a half-mile from the Smith farm. The source of the other stone is uncertain. These stones were the keys that enabled Joseph to see things, as Lucy said, invisible to the natural eye. Emma Smith described one of them as a small stone, not exactly black, but was rather a dark color. As we learn, Joseph was hired to use his own seer stone for treasure seeking. Emma Smith's cousin Joseph Lewis wrote, "Joe Smith never handled one shovel full of earth in those diggings. All that Smith did was to peep with the stone and hat and give directions where and how to dig, and when and where the enchantment moved the treasure." We learn that Joseph Smith was brought to trial for using a seer stone. Joseph Smith said it was for setting the country in an uproar by preaching the Book of Mormon, which was his most recent offense. But Joseph Knight Sr. said Benton swore out the warrant for Joseph's pretending to see underground, going back to the old money-digging charges of the 1826 trial. The fact that Josiah Stoll, Joseph's employer in the silver mine venture, was called to testify suggests that the accusers wished to reopen the case. Benton himself said Joseph Smith was brought to trial in order to check the progress of delusion and open the eyes and understandings of those who blindly followed. From that perspective, money digging and the Book of Mormon were both fraudulent schemes. Benton said in a report to the Evangelical Magazine and Gospel Advocate the next year that the Book of Mormon was brought to light by the same magic power by which he pretended to discover hidden treasure. Now the book continues to talk about seer stone use of Joseph Smith and other saints. In 1841, Joseph showed his other whitish stone to the Council of the 12 in Nauvoo and told them, as Brigham Young reported, quote, that every man who lived on the earth was entitled to a seer stone and should have one, but they are kept from them in consequence of their wickedness. On the day when Joseph commented on the earth as a Urim and Thummim, Clayton was the one who posed the question, quote, is not the reckoning of God's times, angels' time, prophets' time, and man's time according to the planet on which they reside? Unquote. Yes, answered Joseph. and then extended the answer. But there is no angel ministers to this earth, only what either does belong or has belonged to this earth, and the angels do not reside on a planet like our earth, but they dwell with God, and the planet where he dwells is like a crystal and like a sea of glass before the throne. This is the great Urim and Thummim, wherein all things are manifest, both things past, present, and future are all continually before the Lord. Then the white stone mentioned in Revelation is the Urim and Thummim, whereby all things pertaining to an higher order of kingdoms, even all kingdoms, will be made known, and a white stone is given to each of those who come into the celestial kingdom, whereon is a name written, which no man knoweth, save it that he receiveth. The new name is the key word. In 1888, when Wilford Woodruff consecrated a seer stone upon the temple altar in Manti, Utah, he wrote that it was the stone that Joseph found by revelation some 30 feet under the earth and carried by him through life. Additional proof of seer stone use during the Book of Mormon translation. In April, they, Cowdery and Joseph Jr., differed over the question of whether John the ancient apostle died or continued to live, a question suggested by Book of Mormon passages on prophets who never died. They agreed to settle the matter through the interpreters, also known as the seer stone, and learned that the Lord permitted John to tarry until the second coming. Early Mormons valued seer stones as much as Joseph Smith did. The Whitmer family was interested in seer stones long after their association with the Smith family. David Whitmer's grandson, George W. Skewich, kept a photo of his grandfather's seer stone in 1890. George noted on the photo that this was, quote, used as a seer stone, end quote. It's likely that this was the stone George used to obtain revelations for the Whitmer's church during the 1870s and 1880s. During the 1830s church, members used seer stones in Kirtland, Ohio. In a 1831 newspaper reported that some Mormons there pretend to have received a white stone, as in the Book of Revelations. Further explanation of this are in great detail from a book Richard Bushman calls Ingenious. The book is Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, authored by D. Michael Quinn. Let's dig in and read about how other saints use seer stones. Elizabeth Ann Smith Whitney had her own seer stone. Bishop Whitney's brother later stated, Mormon elders and women in Kirtland often search the bed of river for stones with holes caused by the sand washing out to peep into. Joseph used a white stone for a patriarchal blessing. On October 7, 1835, he gave a patriarchal blessing, according to the spirit of prophecy and revelation, to Newell K. Whitney and his wife Elizabeth through the Urim and Thummim, also known as seer stones. This referred to the white seer stone. Whitney was already bishop over the temporal affairs of the church in Ohio and later became presiding bishop over the entire church. This is the only known use of seer stone for giving a patriarchal blessing. During the 1840s, Joseph Smith made other use of the white seer stone. He stated that he had obtained the grand keyword of the temple endowment by the Urim and Thummim. Again, that's the seer stone. In May of 1844, Smith gave Apostle Lehman White his own white stone as part of a secret ordination for White to perform a special mission. Descendants of Elias Pulsifer had stated that while in Kirtland, he found a brown color stone about 2.5 inches wide and 6 inches long with 2 holes in it. The prophet Joseph examined it and declared it to be a seer stone. It is not known if Elias could use it, but his daughter could. She could locate drowned persons, lost cattle, and other items for people who sought such information. Her daughter, a granddaughter of Elias, also could use it and after could see whatever she desired. One strange thing happened though. She once asked to see Satan, which she did, but that was the last time that seer stone ever worked for anyone. In November 1837, the Kirtland High Council disfellowshipped James Colin Brewster, his parents, and several associates for claiming that this 11-year-old boy's revelations and translations of ancient scripture were authoritative. Young Brewster claimed to have the gift of seeing and looking through or into a stone. In 1841, a British seer also ran afoul of the LDS authorities in Staffordshire. William Mountford is the only Mormon for whom there is a contemporary and detailed description of his seeric beliefs and practices. Quote, "When I pray to them in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, anything that I want will come into the glass," end quote. Corden described what Mountford did for a young woman who wanted to see her future husband. Quote, "He brought out the crystal and prayed unto a certain spirit. Then she must peep into the crystal, and in it she would see the young man that would become her husband," end quote. In addition, a later reminiscence stated that this involved several Staffordshire Mormons who would place these stones upon a table and kneel down and pray to one who they addressed as Samazer. According to Gordon, when George A. Smith returned to Nauvoo, he brought the Staffordshire stones for the prophet to examine. Joseph said the stones were a Urim and Thummim as good as ever was upon the earth. However, they have been consecrated to devils. As we learned in Rough Stone Rolling, the Book of Mormon was translated using Joseph's personal seer stone he found digging a well on Willard Chase's property, and not the seer stones provided by the angel Moroni. The church released a new video discussing this in early 2018. Let's watch that now.
For a long time, church art tended to depict the translation of the Book of Mormon as Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery sitting around a table, sometimes with the gold plates out on the table. But that's not really the best match for what we know about the translation process. What do the historical sources from those involved around the time tell us about the translation process?
Well, first of all, Joseph Smith explained that he translated the Book of Mormon through the medium of the Urim and Thummim by the gift and power of God. But he didn't explain further than that.
So what about the seer stone, for instance? What was its involvement in the translation process?
So Emma Smith, Joseph Smith's wife, and Martin Harris, his friend, and David Whitmer, his friend, who were around during the time of the translation of the Book of Mormon, said that he used a seer stone to translate parts of the Book of Mormon as well as the Urim and Thummim. And Martin Harris explained that Joseph Smith started using the seer stone instead of the Urim and Thummim for convenience.
Wait, so what might that mean for convenience?
Well, that's a really good question. We're not really sure what that means, but if you think of the Urim and Thummim, the descriptions that are given of the Urim and Thummim, it's described as two clear stones in a rim like glasses. And the Book of Mormon says that these stones are what constitutes seers. Having and using these stones are what constitutes seers. So the Urim and Thummim actually is this special pair of seer stones. And we have these descriptions of the Urim and Thummim connected to the breastplate, and that they're large and that they don't fit on Joseph Smith's face. And we even have accounts that he takes the lenses out of the rim and puts them in a hat, which is the way he used a seer stone. So if he uses his own seer stone rather than the Urim and Thummim, he can put the Urim and Thummim and the breastplate away somewhere safe and just use his seer stone. And that's more convenient.
Okay, that makes sense, but also sounds a little bit strange to then think of it as Joseph Smith looking at a stone in a hat.
Yeah, that's an image that we're unfamiliar with. But actually, it's not that strange. He's just trying to block out light. That's the point. So it's like on a really sunny day, if you get a text message and you pull out your cell phone and you can't see it because of the sun and you make shade, you block out the light so you can see what it says. It's the same kind of idea. So in the stone, he sees the translation in light, and he puts his face in the hat so he can block out light and see what's on the seer stone.
Can you make the Book of Mormon translation process visual for me for a moment? If I were an artist and to come to you and say, hey, I want to do a depiction of the translation that's more accurate, how should I make that look?
Well, we would actually need two different images. We would need one depiction where Joseph Smith is wearing the breastplate that was connected to the Urim and Thummim, and he's looking through the Urim and Thummim, and he could be looking at the plates. And then we also need the other image where Joseph Smith is with a hat, looking into the hat at a seer stone. The Book of Mormon wasn't just translated in one way. It was translated in different ways at different times.
So the seer stone was integral to the translation of the Book of Mormon, but for some people it's still a little bit uncomfortable to think about that seer stone. Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. I'm not sure exactly why that is. I think a big part of it is just that when Joseph Smith wrote about this in 1838, he talked about the Urim and Thummim spectacles that he found with the golden plates, and he didn't write about the seer stone. And that history became canonized as part of the Pearl Great Price, and that is what Latter-day Saints are familiar with. And we have much less familiarity with other sources that talk about a seer stone. I think that's part of it. It may be that we want things that are miraculous to be ancient, like the Urim and Thummim in the Bible. It may be that a seer stone is too much like an ordinary rock. It's something mundane. But the idea of Joseph Smith using a seer stone to translate, this is an idea that we can get used to. We believe in modern miracles. We believe in a God that can work through small and simple things. And God can speak to Joseph Smith however he wants to.
To read more on this topic and the magic worldview of Joseph Smith, please consider the extensive research done by LDS researcher and author D. Michael Quinn. His book, Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, has the best research written on the topic. Fact number 2. There are 2 theories on how the Book of Mormon was translated: composition theory and transcription theory. Joseph did not pretend to look at the reformed Egyptian words, the language on the plates according to the book's own description. The plates lay covered on the table while Joseph's head was in a hat looking at the seer stone, which by this time had replaced the interpreters. The varying explanations of the perplexing process fall roughly into 2 categories: composition and transcription. The first holds that Joseph was the author of the book. He composed it out of knowledge and imaginings collected in his own mind, perhaps aided by inspiration. He had stuffed his head with the ideas for sermons, Christian doctrine, biblical language, multiple characters, stories of adventure, social criticism, theories of Indian origins, ideas about Mesoamerican civilization, and many other matters. During translation, he composed it all into a narrative dictated over a space of 3 months in Harmony and Fayette. The transcription theory has Joseph Smith seeing the Book of Mormon text in the seer stone, or the Urim and Thummim. He saw the words in the stone as he had seen lost objects or treasure, and dictated them to his secretary. The eyewitnesses who described translation, Joseph Knight, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer, who was in the house during the last weeks of translation, understood translation as transcription. Referring to the seer stone as a Urim and Thummim, Knight said, quote, "Now the way he translated was he put the Urim and Thummim into a hat and darkened his eyes. Then he would take a sentence and it would appear in the bright Roman letters. Then he would tell the writer and he would write it. Then that would go away and the next sentence would come, and so on." End quote. Transcription theory gives us a Joseph with a miraculous gift that evolved out of his earlier treasure seeking. The boy who gazed into stones and saw treasure grew up to become a translator who looked in a stone and saw words. Cowdery was open to the belief in Joseph's powers because he had come to Harmony, the possessor of a supernatural gift, alluded to in a revelation as the gift of Aaron, or the gift of working with a rod. His family may have engaged in treasure seeking and other magical practices in Vermont. Much of their current critical scholarship comes not from hostile outsiders, but from skeptical Mormons still interested in Mormon text. Some of their work is supported by non-profit Smith Pettit Foundation and published by Signature Books, or appears in the independent Mormon journals Sunstone and Dialogue. The scholarship aims to persuade readers that the Book of Mormon can be inspired, even if not historically authentic. Much as critical readings of the Bible do not foreclose its use as a devotional text, The modern critics do not deny the book's interesting and impressive literary, theological, and psychological and spiritual qualities, but claim such writing can be as powerful in providing people with spiritual guidance as non-fiction. These critics see Joseph Smith as a compelling religious writer rather than a visionary revelator, and themselves as an enlightened friend trying to persuade Mormons to adjust to the modern world. They are certain that any reasonable person who takes an objective, scientific approach to the Book of Mormon will recognize the obvious fictional quality of the book. They point to the evidence in the book of the anti-Masonic agitation stirring in New York in the years when it was being translated. In the doctrinal portions, they see the anti-universalist language and imitations of camp meeting preaching. The critics complain that Isaiah passages quoted by Nephi draw upon portions of the book now thought to be pseudepigrapha, composed long after the Nephites left Jerusalem. Turning to archaeology, they point out that archaeological digs have produced no evidence of Nephite civilization, yielding no horse bones, for example, an animal named in the Book of Mormon. Most recently, an anthropological researcher has claimed that Native American DNA samples correspond to Asian patterns, precluding Semitic origins. In view of all the evidence, the critics believe the defense of the book's authenticity is hopeless. Critics have speculated that view of the Hebrews might have fallen into Joseph Smith's hands and inspired the Book of Mormon. Both books speak of migrations to Palestine to America and of a great civilization now lost. Both describe a division that pitted a civilized against a savage branch, with the higher civilization falling into decay. Even though Joseph Smith is not known to have seen the view of the Hebrews until later in his life, the parallels seem strong enough for critics to argue that Ethan Smith provided the seeds for Joseph Smith's later composition. In Washington on February 5th, Joseph spoke to a group that included an educated New Yorker, Matthew Davis, an experienced journalist. In the Washington lecture, Joseph underscored beliefs held in common with other Christians. Quote, "We teach nothing but what the Bible teaches. We believe nothing but what is to be found in this book." Joseph insisted more than once, all who would follow the precepts of the Bible, whether Mormon or not, would be saved. That Joseph claimed the Mormon Bible was communicated to him direct from heaven. Quote, "If there was such a thing on earth as the author of it," he recorded Joseph saying, "then he was the author." But the idea that he wished to impress was that he had penned it as dictated by God. Joseph told the audience he was no savior or worker of miracles. All this was false. He made no such pretensions. He was but a man, he said, a plain, untutored man, seeking what he should do to be saved. Another reporter from the Christian Journal heard part of another address the night before to an intelligent congregation, including several members of Congress. Judging from the report, Joseph's lack of formal education did not make him different. The reporter wrongly guessed that he had evidently a good English education and considered him an energetic and passionate speaker. Because Joseph dwelt on the sufferings of the Mormons, the reporter thought he was dodging the subject of the Book of Mormon, but noted that nonetheless Joseph said he was inspired to write the Golden Bible. Fact number 3. Joseph Smith had many revelations that did not come to pass as it was revealed to him. Although the subject is not listed as a chapter or a topic, most readers will come across them throughout the book. So many, in fact, that I had to make mention of just a few of them, in no particular order. Joseph had a revelation that Hiram Page and Oliver Cowdery were to go to Toronto to sell the copyright of the Book of Mormon to raise money. The alarmed inhabitants of the surrounding county resolved never to purchase the Book of Mormon and tried to persuade Grandin, the Grandin Press, to stop publication. They argued that since Smiths had lost their farm, they could not pay him unless the book sold, and they were not buying. Having entered the contract reluctantly in the first place, Grandin stopped work until he could be assured of payment. In an attempt to start the process again, Harris consulted to sell part of his farm to raise some cash, although only after getting a signed agreement from Joseph Sr., giving Harris the right to sell books on his own account. Impatient with Harris' reluctance, Hiram urged Joseph to leave him out entirely and raise the money by other means. Hiram had heard that the copyright could be sold in Canada and asked Joseph to inquire of the Lord. David Whitmer later reported that Joseph told Cowdery and Hiram Page to go to Toronto and promised them success, but the two returned empty-handed. When Joseph and Hiram returned unsuccessfully, they asked Joseph why the revelation didn't come to pass as the Lord promised. Joseph Smith inquired of God and was told that some revelations are not from God. Quote, "Some revelations are of God, and some revelations are of man, and some are revelations of the devil." End quote. Here are some revelations of the second coming that did not come to pass. Quote, "I, the Almighty, have laid my hands upon the nations to scourge them for their wickedness." The revelation instructed Bishop Whitney to warn the eastern cities the desolation and utter abolishment which awaits them if they do reject these things. You'll find that in Doctrine and Covenants 84, verses 114. In the early years, the saints thought a half-dozen years would bring about the end. Awakened one morning at 4 a.m. to see the signs in the heavens, Joseph Smith reported, quote, "I arose and beheld to my great joy the stars fall from heaven, a sure sign the coming of Christ is close at hand." End quote. In a sermon urging people to build up the cities of the Lord, he, Joseph, told them, quote, "Zion and Jerusalem must both be built up before the coming of Christ. More than 40 years will pass before this work will be accomplished. And when these cities are built, then shall the coming of Son of Man be." Joseph's followers wanted his opinion on the second coming. Seeking light on the subject, he received a partial answer. On a Sunday morning in April, he told the people what he had learned. Quote, "I earnestly desired to know concerning the coming of the Son of Man, and prayed, when a voice said to me, 'Joseph, my son, if thou livest until thou art 85 years old, thou shalt see the face of the Son of Man. Therefore let this suffice, and trouble me no more on this matter.'" A few days later, at a conference in the temple, he ventured an interpretation. Quote, "I took the liberty to conclude that if I did live till what time he would make his appearance, but I do not say whether he will make his appearance, or I shall go where he is." End quote. Joseph Sr. gives a false promise to Joseph during a father's blessing. At the School of the Prophets in January 1833, as Joseph was about to wash his father's feet, he asked for a father's blessing. Joseph Sr. laid his hands on his son's head and promised that he would, quote, "continue in his priest's office until Christ's come." Another set of revelations came from Zion's camp. When two emissaries from the saints in Clay County, Missouri, arrived in Kirtland in February, he took action. After hearing the report, Joseph declared that he was going to Zion to redeem the land and called for the council's assent. The members agreed unanimously, nominating Joseph as commander-in-chief of the armies of Israel. A revelation at the time of the February 1834 council meeting told the saints that, quote, "The redemption of Zion must needs come by power, and the Lord would raise up unto my people a man who shall lead them like Moses led the children of Israel." End quote. When the little band finally reached Missouri, it was disbanded before a shot was fired. On Sunday, June 22nd, the Mormons' attorneys made their counter-proposal for purchasing the Jackson County lands to Clay County Sheriff Cornelius Gilliam, who published the plan in the Liberty, Missouri Inquirer. By then, however, the negotiations were dead. That same day, Joseph still went outside of Jackson County, received a revelation telling the camp to disband for the time being. On Monday, their lawyers advised them to give up any tactical alternatives. Joseph agreed. The more bellicose camp members were unhappy. George Albert Smith said that several of the brethren apostatized because they were not going to have the privilege of fighting. John Whitmore felt hopes were blasted at least for a season when the decision was made to disband. These militants had marched to Missouri expecting to redeem Zion by force, as Joseph's revelations predicted. Seeing a man with cramps earlier in the week, George A. Smith suspected cholera, a plague that had ravaged the county in recent years. During the week, beginning on June 23rd, one member after another of the now demilitarized camp was struck with terrible stomach pains. On June 25th, the first death occurred, followed a half hour later by the second. 68 members of the camp contracted the disease during a 4-day siege, and 14 died. Among the fatalities was Sidney Gilbert, the storekeeper who had managed the negotiations for the Mormons over the past few weeks. Responding to the shrieks of pain that filled the camp, Joseph gave the victims flour and whiskey and ministered by laying on the hands. Nothing worked. Each time Joseph laid hands on the victim, the disease would pass into his own body. I quickly learned by painful experience, he later wrote, that when the great Jehovah decrees destruction on any people, makes known his determination, man must not attempt to stay his hand. Why else would God punish camp members for seeking relief? Joseph remembered the unsettling contradictions. Elder John S. Carter was the first man who stepped forward to rebuke it, and upon this was instantly seized and became the first victim in the camp. The men who buried Carter united, coveted, and prayed, hoping the disease would be stayed, but in vain, for while thus covenanting, Elder Wilcox died. Pleading with God attracted a bolt of lightning in the camp extremity. Joseph seems to have called up a God out of his Puritan past, a God who would destroy his own people if they neglected his commands. This was God, we must assume, to whom Joseph felt responsible for establishing Zion and preparing his people for exaltation. A God harsh and implacable, inflicting punishment on this who failed. Now we move on to the Salem, Massachusetts revelation. Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Oliver Cowdery, and Hiram Smith left Kirtland in late July and traveled to Salem, Massachusetts. Quote, I have much treasure in this city for you, for the benefit of Zion, and many people in this city whom I will gather out in due time for the benefit of Zion. End quote. The revelation put the best face on a misbegotten venture. Long after the event, Ebenezer Robinson, a printer in Nauvoo, remembered that a convert named Bergs had persuaded church leaders that a sum of money was hidden in the cellar of a Salem house. Perhaps Joseph believed he could identify the site using his boyhood gifts as a treasure seeker. Less encouraging, though, the Salem revelation opened with the words, I, the Lord your God, am not displeased with your comings this journey, notwithstanding your follies, and tried to deflect the men to missionary work. There are more treasures than the one for you in this city. The wealth pertaining to gold and silver could be obtained in due time, implying that meanwhile they should concentrate on people. For those 2 weeks, the men taught from house to house, taking time out to visit the famous East Indian Marine Society Museum like ordinary tourists. On August 20th, Rigdon lectured on Christianity at the Lyceum, all while they looked for the treasure house. On August 19th, Joseph wrote Emma, we have found the house since Brother Bergs left us. Very luckily and providentially, as we had one spell been most discouraged. They were plotting out to get possession. The house is occupied, and it will require much care and patience to rent or buy it. Joseph said they were willing to wait months if necessary, but by September the party was back in Kirtland with no treasure for their pains. Fact number 4. Dr. Dennison planned to castrate Joseph Smith during a mob attack on Joseph to punish Joseph for supposed intimacy with Nancy Miranda. In early 1832, opposition took a violent turn. On Saturday, March 24th, Joseph was dragged from his bedroom in the dead of night. His attackers strangled him until he blacked out, tore off his shirt and drawers, beat and scratched him, and jammed a vial of poison against his teeth until it broke. After tarring and feathering his body, they left him for dead. In a later memoir, Luke Johnson, one of the John Johnson's sons, said that during the attack, Joseph was stretched on a board and tantalized in the most insulting and brutal manner. They tore off the few night clothes that he had on for the purpose of emasculating him and had Dr. Dennison there to perform the operation. But when the doctor saw the prophet stripped and stretched on the plank, his heart failed him, and he refused to operate. The mob apparently meant to castrate Joseph. The historian Fawn Brodie, who wrote the book No Man Knows My History, The Life of Joseph Smith, speculated that one of the John Johnson's sons, Eli, meant to punish Joseph for an intimacy with his sister Miranda. Fact number 5. Brigham Young left his terminally ill wife and 2 young daughters to follow Joseph Smith. After baptism, Young gave himself over entirely to his new religion. That summer, he left his tubercular wife and 2 daughters, abandoned his carpentry shop and tools, and went on the road to preach. When he returned, he nursed his ailing wife until her death in September, and then was gone again, leaving his 2 daughters with the Kimballs. No further information on the topic can be found anywhere in the book. However, it has been expanded on by LDS historian Leonard Arrington, a longtime friend of Richard Bushman, in his book, The American Moses. In the book, we find a more detailed description of the story. From the book, it's difficult now to comprehend the intensity in which these early Mormon converts grasped the new gospel. It became their vocation and avocation. Brigham, feeling its power so strongly that he abandoned his shop and trade to devote himself wholeheartedly to the kingdom of God. Brigham placed Miriam, by now in weakened consumptive condition, under the care of Violet Kimball, and spent the summer of 1832 traveling and preaching with Heber. He returned to Mendon to find Miriam dying. Still in the Kimball's house, he nursed her through the final weeks. At last, on September 8, 1832, clapping her hands, praising the Lord, she drew her last breath. Brigham buried her in the town cemetery not far from his shop and accepted the Kimball's offer to keep his daughters, Elizabeth, who was 7, and Violet, who was 2. There was now nothing to prevent from devoting himself fully to the church. Later he referred to his young manhood and first marriage as seeming so long ago and far away that it was if they had been part of the life of a different person. It was no accident that about the same time as her death, actually starting somewhat earlier, he was drawing close to a new religion. It gave him new loyalty, a new commitment. It provided meaning in his life that he had not experienced before. In some ways, the intense personal attachment to the prophet Joseph Smith took the place of his marriage. Fact number 6. There was influence from the temperance movement that inspired Joseph's word of wisdom. Also, Joseph Smith and the early saints often drank wine, even whiskey, and tea. Emma may have objected to the stains on the floor and the smell in the room and asked Joseph to do something about it. The word of wisdom, as the revelation was later called, came at a time when temperance and food reforms were flourishing in the United States. In 1835, Sylvester Graham lectured in New York and Philadelphia against tobacco, tea, coffee, and alcohol, advocating a diet based on whole grains. The saints differed over how rigorously to apply the word of wisdom. Some were inclined to make exact compliance a requirement of membership. Others were more relaxed. Joseph drank tea and a glass of wine from time to time. Fact number 7. Joseph and the early saints often spoke in tongues, and women gave blessings. A spiritual outburst on January 22nd, 1833, foreshadowed what lay ahead for the school of the prophets. A conference was suddenly visited with the gift of tongues. Joseph spoke in another tongue, followed by Zebedee, Coltrane, and William Smith, and finally all the elders, along with several of the members of the church, both male and female, much speaking and praying all in tongues, occupied the conference before the adjournment. At a late hour, the next day, the men came together again and started speaking, praying, and singing, all in tongues. We have a couple of examples of women giving blessings. From the book, some members objected to women laying hands on the sick as if they were priesthood holders. Joseph answered the critics by saying, all that believed, whether male or female, had the promise of casting out devils and healing the sick. He replied that there could be no more sin in any female laying hands on the sick than the wetting the face with water. Women did not need priesthood to minister. It is no sin for anybody to do it that has faith, Joseph said. Women administered by faith, no priesthood. Fact number 8. The Book of Abraham and the Kinderhook plates were not translated as we previously thought. In the summer of 1835, Joseph returned to translating the peculiar form of revelation he had set aside in 1833 when the revision of the Bible was completed. Reawakening his interest was the visit of one Michael H. Chandler, who arrived in Kirtland on July 3, 1835, with 4 mummies and some rolls of papyrus. Joseph announced that one roll contained the writings of Abraham of Ur, and another the writings of Joseph of Egypt. Excited by this discovery, he encouraged some of the Kirtland saints to purchase 4 mummies and the papyri for $2,400, a huge sum when money was desperately needed for other projects. The first chapter and part of the second of the Book of Abraham were completed by 1837 and probably earlier. The remainder may not have been produced until early 1842, shortly before the publication in the church newspaper, The Times and Season. The really interesting fact here is the translation of the writings of Joseph of Egypt never appeared. Of all the men working on the papyri, only Joseph produced a coherent text. What was going on as he translated? For many years, Mormons assumed that he sat down with the scrolls, looked at each Egyptian word, and by inspiration understood its meaning in English. He must have been reading from a text, so Mormons thought, much as a conventional translator would do, except the words came by revelation rather than out of his own learning. In 1967, that view of translation suffered a blow when 11 scraps of the Abraham papyri, long since lost and believed to have been burned, were discovered in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and given to Latter-day Saint leaders in Salt Lake City. Color pictures were soon printed and scholars went to work. The texts were thought to be the Abraham papyri because Joseph had published facsimiles from papyri with his translation, and the same pictures appeared on the fragments. Moreover, some of the characters from the Egyptian grammar appeared on the fragments. The translation of these texts by expert Egyptologists would finally prove or disprove Joseph's claims to have miraculous translating powers. Some Mormons were crushed when the fragments turned out to be rather conventional funerary text placed with mummified bodies. In this case, Hor, to assure continuing life as an immortal god, according to the Egyptologists, nothing on the fragments resembled Joseph's account of Abraham. The peculiar fact is that the results were not entirely out of line with the huge apocrypha literature on Abraham. His books of Abraham picked up themes found in texts like the Book of Fasher and Flavius Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews. The similarities are far from complete, but the parallels extend to numerous small details. Joseph may have heard the apocryphal stories of Abraham, although the Book of Fasher was not published in English until 1829 and not in the United States until 1840. A Bible dictionary published by the American Sunday School Union summed up many of the apocryphal elements that you find in the Book of Abraham. Whether Joseph knew of an alternate account of Abraham or not, he created an original narrative that echoed apocryphal stories without imitating them, either by revelation as his followers believed, or by some instinctive affinity for antiquity. Joseph made his own late and unlikely entry in the long tradition of extra-biblical narratives about the great patriarch. Now let's move on to the Kinderhook plates. Joseph's prophetic powers were put to the test. In April, a dozen men in Kinderhook, Pike County, Illinois, said they had dug 12 feet into a mound on the property of a local merchant. Robert Wiley found 6 small bell-shaped brass plates with undecipherable writings on them. Within a few weeks, the plates were in Joseph's hands with a request for a translation. Wiley claimed he began the dig after dreaming about the treasure in the mound 3 nights in succession. The more likely story is that Wiley won W. Fugit, and a local blacksmith named Witten counterfeited the plates by engraving the characters with acid. They cast this lure before the Mormon prophet in hopes of catching him in a Fing translation. William Clayton wrote, quote, "Joseph has translated a portion and says they contain the history of the person with whom they were found, and he was a descendant of Ham through the loins of Pharaoh king of Egypt, and that he received his kingdom from the ruler of heaven and earth." End quote. Instead of exposing the plot immediately as they had probably intended to, they said nothing until 1879 when one of them signed an affidavit describing the fabrication. Church historians continued to insist on the authenticity of the Kinderhook plates until 1980, over 100 years later, when an examination conducted by the Chicago Historical Society, possessor of one plate proved it was a 19th century creation. Fact number 9. The first polygamous marriage of Joseph Smith was with Fanny Alger. There is evidence that Joseph was a polygamist by 1835. Was he an adulterer? In an angry letter written in 1838, Oliver Cowdery referred to the dirty, nasty, filthy affair of Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger. Alger was 14 when her family joined the church in Mayfield, near Kirtland, in 1830. In 1836, after a time as a serving girl in the Smith household, she left Kirtland and soon married. Between those two dates, perhaps as early as 1831, she and Joseph were reportedly involved. But conflicting accounts make it difficult to establish the facts, much less to understand Joseph's thoughts. Was he a blackguard covering his lust with religious pretensions, or a prophet doggedly adhering to instructions from heaven, or something in between? The minutes of Oliver Cowdery's excommunication trial before the Far West High Council in April 1838 is one of the few contemporaneous sources. Cowdery, long Joseph's friend and associate in visions, was a casualty of bad times. In 1838, he was charged with seeking to destroy the character of President Joseph Smith Jr. by falsely insinuating that he was guilty of adultery. Fanny Alger's name was never mentioned, but doubtless she was the woman in question. Eventually, the court concluded that Cowdery had made false accusations and cut him off from the church. Cowdery denied that he had lied about Joseph and Alger. Cowdery had heard the accusations against him, and he wrote Joseph in January of 1838, quote, "I learned from Kirtland by the last letters that you have publicly said that when you were here, I confessed to you that I had willfully lied about you." He demanded that Joseph retract the statement. In a letter to his brother Warren, Cowdery insisted he would never dishonor the family name by lying about anything, much less about the Smiths, whom he had always defended. In his conversations with Joseph, Cowdery asserted, In every instant, I did not fail to affirm that what I had said was strictly true. Meaning he believed Joseph did have an affair. His insinuations were not lies, but the truth as he understood it. Presumably, he, Joseph, felt innocent because he had married Alger. Fact number 10. Joseph Smith married between 30 and 40 wives. The date when plural marriage was begun will remain uncertain. Todd Compton, putting the evidence in this massive history, concluded that Joseph began practicing plural marriage around 1833. The sources offer conflicting testimony on when the principle was revealed. The plural marriage revelation was finally written down July 12th of 1843. Levi Hancock remembered the prophet telling him in 1832, "Brother Levi, the Lord has revealed to me that it is his will that the righteous men shall take righteous women, even in the plurality of wives, that a righteous race may be sent forth upon the earth, preparatory to the ushering in of the millennial reign of our Redeemer." Joseph ordinarily followed commandments punctually, as if disobedience put him at risk. In the case of plural marriage, he held off for 2 or 3 years before marrying Fanny Alger, and then after this one unsuccessful attempt, waited another 5 years. The delay showed an uncharacteristic reluctance, hard for one who feared God. In some of Joseph's revelations, the Lord speaks as a friend, but in others with a voice of thunder. Writing to a woman whom he hoped would be his wife, he described the two sides of the image. Our Heavenly Father is more liberal in his views and boundless in his mercies and blessings than we are ready to believe or receive, and at the same time is as terrible to workers of iniquity, more awful in the execution of his punishments, and more ready to detect every false way than we are apt to suppose him to be. God was both kind and terrible. By delaying plural marriage, Joseph risked provoking God's wrath. Mary Rollins Leiter, one of his plural wives, later said Joseph told her about the pressure he was under. "The angel came to me 3 times between the year of 34 and 42 and said I was to obey that principle or he would slay me." Others told the story with an additional detail. The angel held a drawn sword. Within 15 months of marrying Lucy Beeman, Joseph had married 11 other women. 8 of the 11 were married to other men. All of them went on living with their first husbands after marrying the prophet. Joseph told a prospective wife that submitting to plural marriage would ensure your eternal salvation and exaltation and that of your father's household and all your kindred. In October 1841, Joseph married Zena Huntington Jacobs, wife of Henry Jacobs. Zena was a pious young woman of 20 who had spoken in tongues and heard angels singing. Joseph and Emma had cared for Zena and her siblings for 3 months in 1839 to 1840 after their mother died. When Joseph explained plural marriage to her the following year, her first response was to resist. Accepting Henry, who was courting her at the time, meant saying no to Joseph. Zena changed her mind after her brother told her the angel threatening Joseph's position and his life. That image plus her own inquiries convinced her, quote, "I searched the scripture and by humble prayer to my heavenly Father I obtained a testimony for myself that God had required that order to be established in this church." End quote. Even after this assurance, she despaired of the consequences. Quote, "I made a greater sacrifice than to give my life, for I never anticipated again to be looked upon as an honorable woman by those I dearly loved." End quote. On October 27, 1841, her brother Dimmock performed the marriage on the banks of the Mississippi. The personal anguish caused by plural marriage did not stop Joseph Smith from marrying more women. He married 3 in 1841, 11 in 1842, and 17 in 1843. 8 additional women were sealed to Joseph in the temple after his death, possibly implying a marriage while he was still alive. One young woman, Lucy Walker, was struck with horror on hearing the doctrine. She was 15 when the prophet invited her to live in his house. Her parents had joined the Mormons in 1832 in Vermont, and then later migrated to New York, to Missouri, and then on to Illinois, where Lucy's mother died of malaria fevers. Joseph told Lucy's father he would look after his children while John Walker went on a mission. Lucy's older brother, Lauren, a worker on Joseph's farm, was fast becoming a favorite. The children were treated like sons and daughters. Lucy worked as Emma's maid while going to school. In 1842, when Lucy was 15 or 16, Joseph told her, quote, "I have a message for you. I have been commanded of God to take another wife, and you are the woman." Lucy was astounded. This announcement was indeed a thunderbolt to me, as she said. "Do you believe me to be a prophet of God?" Joseph asked. "Most assuredly I do," she reported, herself saying in a later autobiography. "He fully explained to me the principle of plural and celestial marriage. Said this principle again to be restored for the benefit of the human family, that it would prove an everlasting blessing to my father's house and form a chain that could never be broken, worlds without end." "What have you to say?" Joseph asked her. "Nothing," she replied. Rather than exert more pressure, Joseph backed away. "If you will pray sincerely for the light and understand in relation thereto, you shall receive a testimony of the correction of this principle." Lucy felt tempted and tortured beyond endurance until life was not desirable. "Oh, let this bitter cup pass," she moaned. For months, Joseph said nothing more. Then in the spring of 1843, he spoke with Lucy's brother William, followed the usual pattern of asking for permission from a relative. William told Joseph that Lucy must decide for herself. In April 1843, Joseph spoke again, and this time he exerted pressure. Quote, "I will give you until tomorrow to decide this matter. If you reject this message, the gate will be closed forever against you." Lucy hated that. This aroused every drop of scotch in my veins. I felt at this moment that I was called to place myself upon the altar, a living sacrifice, perhaps to brook the world in disgrace and incur the displeasure and contempt of my youthful companions. All my dreams of happiness blown to the four winds. This was too much. The thought was unbearable. Facing the ultimatum, Lucy bluntly refused unless God himself told her otherwise, and emphatically forbade him speaking again to me on this subject. Joseph blithely replied, "God Almighty bless you," promised her a manifestation, and left. After a sleepless night in prayer, Lucy felt something in her room. Quote, "My room became filled with a heavenly influence. To me, it was in comparison like the brilliant sunshine bursting through the darkest cloud. My soul was filled with a calm, sweet peace that I never knew. Supreme happiness took possession of my whole being." End quote. On May 1st, 1843, William Clayton married Joseph to Lucy. "It was not a love matter," she wrote later, "but simply the giving up of myself as a sacrifice to establish that grand and glorious principle that God had revealed to the world." After Joseph's death, Lucy bore 9 children as the plural wife of Heber C. Kimball. Fact number 11. The temple endowment was partially inspired by Freemasonry. Portions of the temple ritual resemble Masonic rites that Joseph had observed when a Nauvoo lodge was organized in March 1842, and that he may have heard about from Hiram, a Mason from New York days. The Nauvoo endowment was first bestowed just 6 weeks after Joseph's induction. The similarities were marked enough for Heber Kimball to quote Joseph saying that Freemasonry was taken from priesthood but has become degenerate, but many things are perfect. Joseph often requested revelation about things that caught his attention. His revision of the Bible had sparked questions that resulted in revelations such as the vision of the three glories. Tensions in the South Carolina brought on a revelation about coming civil war. He had a green thumb for growing ideas from tiny seeds. Masonic rites seem to have been one more provocation. Freemasonry, emerging from a slump after the anti-Masonic frenzy of the early 1830s, began in Nauvoo with a few Mormon Masons who wanted to organize a lodge. Fewer than 200 Masons were distributed among the 5 lodges in Illinois in 1841. But in the next year, 6 new lodges were organized in the state besides the Mormon lodges. James Adams, a Mormon convert and probate judge in Springfield, encouraged Mormon Masons to apply. In June 1841, they petitioned for sponsorship and received it from Abraham Jones, a Jewish Mason and Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Illinois. Jonas' belief in equality and brotherhood disposed him to befriend the saints, and he was also seeking support in his run for state legislator. Jonas formed the Mormons into a temporary lodge of ancient York Masons with George Miller as the worshipful master, and Hiram Smith as the senior warden. The new lodge quickly received membership applications from 41 Mormons, including Joseph Sidney Rigdon and 5 of the 12 apostles. In March of 1842, Jonas came to Nauvoo to install the new members. Joseph became an entered apprentice Mason on March 15, 1842. Then Jonas dubbed Joseph a Mason on site to allow him to officiate as chaplain while being installed. The next day, Joseph rose through degrees of fellow craft and master mason. If Joseph thought of Freemasonry as a degenerate priesthood, he did nothing to suppress his rival. Once the Nauvoo Lodge was organized, Mormons joined in large numbers. 11 of the 12 apostles became Freemasons. By October 1842, the 253 members of the Nauvoo Lodge outnumbered the 227 Masons and all the other Illinois lodges combined. Masonic instruction would have attracted Joseph. Masonic candidates sought light, a powerful word in Joseph's revelation. Biblical imagery was mixed generously with a conglomeration of symbols, grips, signs, tools, architecture, objects, scriptures, stories, actions, many of them references to the craft of Masonry. After the ceremony initiating members into a higher degree, a lecture summarizing the symbols and their importance for instilling virtue and brotherhood, the outcome was a circle of committed brethren, loyal to each other to death, forming a bulwark against a wicked world. Intrigued by the Masonic rites, Joseph turned the materials to his own use. The Masonic elements that appear in the temple endowment were embedded in a distinctive context. The creation instead of the Temple of Solomon, exaltation rather than fraternity, God in Christ, not the worshipful master. Temple covenants bound people to God rather than each other. At the end, the participants entered symbolically into the presence of God. Bonus fact! Now this fact was so strange, I had to share it separately from the rest of the presentation. Did you know the first priesthood ordinations broke out with the elders being possessed by evil spirits? I know, right? I didn't know either. But let's jump into the book and find out what happened. In early June, 44 elders, 4 priests, and 15 teachers met in a log schoolhouse near Isaac Morley's farm, hoping for a spiritual endowment. Levi Hancock, who had earlier been startled by visionaries, was baffled by what happened that day. In an expansive spirit, Joseph said that Christ's kingdom, like a grain of mustard seed, was now before him, and some should see it put forth its branches. According to Hancock, Joseph promised Lyman White he would see Christ that day. White soon turned stiff and white, exclaiming that he had indeed viewed the Savior. According to Hancock, Joseph himself said, "I now see God and Jesus Christ at his right hand." Then the meeting unraveled. Joseph ordained Harvey Whitlock to the high priesthood, the most important business of the meeting, and Whitlock reacted badly. Quote, "He turned as black as Lehman was white," Hancock reported. "His fingers were set like claws. He went around the room and showed his hands and tried to speak. His eyes were in the shape of oval O's." Astonished at the turn of events, Hiram exclaimed, "Joseph, that is not of God." Joseph, unwilling to cut the phenomenon short, told Hiram to wait, but Hiram insisted, "I will not believe unless you inquire of God, and he owns it." Hancock said that Joseph bowed his head and in a short time got up and commanded Satan to leave Harvey, laying his hands upon his head at the same time. Then Hancock said Lehman Copley, who weighed over 200 pounds, somersaulted in the air and fell on his back over a bench. White cast the Satan out of Copley, and Copley was calmed. The evil spirit, according to Hancock, was in and out of people all day and the greater part of the night. Joseph, who was ordaining men to the high priesthood, came eventually to Hancock and assured him he had a calling as high as any man in the house. The words brought Hancock relief. Quote, "I was glad for that, for I was so scared. I would not stir without his liberty for all the world." This was not the spiritual endowment the elders had expected, and the outburst may have contributed to trouble and unbelief among the disciples. John Whitmer noted that about this time, some apostatized and became enemies to the cause of God and persecuted the saints. I really hope you enjoyed watching this presentation. Hopefully I was able to summarize the book without having you read hundreds of pages. Please like this video, share it with your friends, and be on the lookout for our multi-video docu-series called The History of the LDS Saints, Church History You Were Never Taught in Sunday School.